victory is said to have taken place in this very valley roughly 3,000 years ago. It's a Bible story about how, with just a stone and a sling, a young shepherd boy defeated a Philistine giant who was nearly 10 feet tall and covered with armor from head to toe. But this story is about so much more than just the underdog winning. It's a story about the armies of Israel, the armies of the living God, being defied and then vindicated. It's about God intervening and giving Israel the victory. And it's about David being vaulted into political fame and closer to kingship over Israel. But how true is this story? And are there any archaeological remains to support its unbelievable narrative? In this episode, we will hear what archaeologists, historians, and theologians have to say about David and Goliath. And we will discover how a young, humble shepherd had enough confidence in God's faithfulness to fearlessly confront a powerful giant and win a miraculous victory for Israel. Behind me, the fields of Bethlehem. It was in these very fields that a young boy named David, the son of Jesse, took care of his father's sheep. It was in this setting that David found inspiration to write many of his songs, which we find in the Bible. Among them, the most famous song, "The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." In the hills and valleys behind me, David first experienced God's presence and learned to overcome his fears with God's help. The Bible tells us that when a lion or bear would come and carry off a sheep from his flock, David would chase it down and rescue the sheep from its jaws. One day, David's father asked him to bring food to his brothers who were at war with the Philistines in the valley of Elah. There, things were not going so well for Israel. In 1 Samuel 17, we read, "A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span, or 9 feet 9 inches. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he wore a coat of scale armor of bronze. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels, or about 15 pounds. Then the Philistine said, 'This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man, and let us fight each other.' On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. Little did David know that upon leaving his sheep here in Bethlehem, his life was about to change forever. Upon his arrival in the valley of Elah, David would overhear Goliath's challenge, and the skills David had acquired as a shepherd, combined with his confidence in God, would win an incredible victory for Israel. This is the land of Israel, the Promised Land. Upon this rugged terrain, Israel's most miraculous victories have been won. Among them, the world's most well-known and beloved, David's triumph over the giant Goliath. But in order to truly appreciate this incredible victory, we need to learn a bit more about David and travel back in time almost 4,000 years, where his story really begins. The Bible tells us that while David's forefather Jacob was on his deathbed, he blessed each of his children and foretold the destiny of their tribes, as inspired by God. When he came to the tribe of Judah, he said, "The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he to whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nations shall be his." According to this prophecy, Israel's future kings were to be of the tribe of Judah, the bloodline through which the Messiah would ultimately come into the world. And this was the tribe into which King David was born.
His family line is the tribe of Judah. Judah is going all the way back to the blessing that Jacob gives to his sons before he passes away. This is the royal bloodline of the Jewish people. Judah is not the firstborn of Jacob, that's Reuven, but because of his mistakes he makes, he kind of is pushed aside. Judah seems to have the right stuff in his internal spiritual DNA to be the leadership tribe of the Jewish people. When the Jews enter the land of Israel and settle the land of Israel, the tribe of Judah literally gets the entire southern part of the country. The tribe of Shimon is kind of in the middle of them, but from Jerusalem to the south, that's all Judah. So this is the official family of kingship and leadership in the Jewish people.
Having miraculously conquered the Promised Land under the leadership of Joshua, the land was divided up according to the various tribes of Israel. The stage was at last set for Israel to anoint its very first king. But while the book of Joshua recounts Israel's conquest through unwavering faith in God, the book of Judges, which follows, tells us that after the death of Joshua, the tribes of Israel did not fully follow God's instructions.
We know that Judges is a very difficult book. All the time, the tribes are falling into idolatry, and then a judge is being raised up to help them through it. And this was necessary. God even says in the Torah, before they go to settle the land, even only after you settle the land, that's when you can choose a king. So they waited and they waited. And then the story of Judges finishes with a terrible event with the Benjaminites. And that's when the nation goes, we need a king. And they preempt a king. We know that David ultimately was supposed to become king, but they preempt Saul. Because they just saw that they're in need of a king to unite them. But they choose a king according to the way the nations will choose a king. We see in the Torah, in God's law, he says, when you choose a king, and a king will be chosen, he should not have lots of gold and silver, horses, wives, and he should walk the whole time with the Torah. He should write his own Torah, and he should walk with it, because that is the key to his success.
Despite God's warning not to choose a king as other nations did, Saul of the tribe of Benjamin was selected as Israel's first king. The Bible tells us that Saul's family was well known and respected in Israel. He was very handsome and a head taller than everyone else. He seemed like the perfect choice. But God's choice was, as prophesied, from the tribe of Judah. God's choice was David, a young boy spending his days hard at work in the lonely fields of Bethlehem, perhaps the least likely candidate in the promised land.
When Saul blows it, when he doesn't listen to the prophet Samuel and obliterate the Amalekites, our arch enemy, Samuel tells him, God's rejected you, and he's going to choose someone who's better than you. And the story's fascinating because then Samuel goes down to the tribe of Judah, and he goes to Bethlehem, where David is, where Jesse, Yishai, is living, and he's being directed by God. It's like GPS, which is God positioning satellite. He's telling him, go down there, you're going to find the successor. And David is the youngest of 8 boys, the least physically impressive. Jewish tradition says he was a redhead, and he was the one that always reminds you of that Cinderella story when the evil stepsisters, not that David's brothers were evil, but you know, they show up with the glass slipper, she's mopping the floors. They don't even bring her down, and they're trying to stick the shoe on her. Samuel shows up, and Jesse comes with the prophet Samuel's here. This is exciting. All the brothers line up like the inspection of the guard, and he looks at all of them, and he says, they're all very impressive young men. anyone else in the house? And they go, yeah, we got this. One more younger brother, but he's out, tending the goats. They bring him in. Samuel takes one look at him. He takes out his flask of anointing oil. He pours it on his head. And they're like, him? That's another great line. Samuel says, don't look at the outside. He says, humans judge the exterior. God sees the heart.
From the beginning, his life was overshadowed with some events that was very, very questionable. We trace it back even to the times of Judah and Tamar, where we know that a responsibility was not taken up and extreme measures had to be put in place for his forefather to be born, and that was very, very difficult, that whole event that foreshadowed. Also, we know that Ruth, his grandmother, was a Moabite. And we read in the Bible that the Moabites are not allowed into Klal Israel for a few generations.
The Moabites are considered people who are so tainted because of their lineage, which goes all the way back to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and Lot and his daughters having a relationship with him and having children to that relationship. They're considered very tainted. Ironic that the royal bloodline of the Jewish people, and ultimately the Messiah would come from that, is a very powerful statement about how little where you come from matters and how much more who you are and what you do is really much more important. It's a big lesson for, I think, everyone in this world.
So that specifically caused trouble for David. How do we know that? When you read the biblical text, you can't really see that. You just see that he's struggling. You can just see that he's set up against the odds, but you don't know why. It's when you go into the oral tradition and the oral law of the Jewish tradition that you can find the gaps being filled in and understanding why he was isolated as he was. But him being set up against the odds, and this isolation actually worked in his favor, because that's how he developed a very intimate relationship with God. He learned by himself with God how to fight the lion and the bear, and that set him up to become the king that he was born to be.
After David was anointed by Samuel, it would not be an easy ascension to Israel's throne. Saul remained king, and David resumed the humble responsibilities of a shepherd. But it was here, in the fields of Bethlehem, that David became prepared for kingship. Through the dark valleys where predators lurked, he learned to trust his Maker and fear nothing. It was here that David learned how to strike down a bear or lion to retrieve a sheep from its jaws. Here in the remote pastures around Bethlehem, David developed a deep connection to the God of Israel, the powerful Lord of Israel's armies. Every trial David faced set him on the path to become Israel's greatest warrior king. And this warrior king would at last capture Israel's attention when he fearlessly confronts Goliath, the dreaded giant Philistine. But who are these infamous enemies of Israel we call Philistines? And how is it that they are living in the land God designated to Israel?
The Leon Levy expedition from 1985 to 2016 did some in-depth research and excavation in Ashkelon regarding the Philistines, and we've learned a tremendous amount about the Philistines during those excavations. In the beginning it was by Lawrence Stager, afterwards by Daniel Masters, and at the end of these excavations and research they found DNA that could be traced, and they can now trace that the Philistines came from Crete and Iberia and Sardinia, but from the west, from Europe.
But the Philistines will inhabit the southern part of Israel. There's 5 major Philistine cities. There's Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gat, Gaza, and Ekron that have all been excavated today. And these are people who will settle there and will basically be a seafaring people living on the coast at various periods of time. If you look in the book of Genesis already, Abraham, Isaac, they're dealing with these people.
They're also not one of the 7 nations that God speaks of to be removed from the land. It's only afterwards that we know that Abimelech, the king at that stage, the Philistine king, had a pact with Abram. It was only broken later, and that's where the war started with the Philistines.
Literally, the Philistines are sort of ubiquitous in the early narrative of the Bible. They're always around. You see that Abraham goes and lives with the Philistines. Isaac goes and lives with the Philistines. We fight with the Philistines off and off. It's ironic that King David not only fights the Philistines, the David and Goliath story, but at one point when the King Saul is trying to kill him, he goes and lives with the Philistines. So we have a very interesting relationship with them.
During King Saul's reign, the Philistines were at war with Israel. And although by modern definition, a Philistine is someone uncultured and ignorant, the Philistines that inhabited the Promised Land in David's day actually presented an enormous threat.
When you call someone a Philistine today, it's sort of a negative term. He's a Philistine. But it's very clear from Jewish sources like the book of Judges that the Philistines were on a technological level more advanced than the Jews. They had the literal edge in metal technology, which is where the term having the edge comes from. You know, you have copper, bronze, and iron. And to the extent that your metal tools or weapons hold an edge for longer and are sharper and more durable, that gives you literally the edge in both agriculture and in military.
The Philistines at the time are a foreboding, growing empire. They have a strong army. They have a champion.
In this battle scene, which takes place in Emek Elah, which is south of what's today Beit Shemesh, you can today see where the battle scene is. It's a valley on either side. And this is classic ancient warfare, where you'd have, rather than have this massive battle, you know, one side would present a champion. We're familiar with this from the Greek literature, but it's not as something that's only Greek. Why should we all kill each other? We'll present a champion. The outcome of that battle, whoever dies, that side will lose.
The Bible tells us that while Israel and the Philistines were positioned for war, with the valley of Elah between them, the giant champion, Goliath, emerged from the Philistine camp and began to challenge Israel. He said, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man, and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will be your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us. This day I defy the armies of Israel."
There's the Jewish army, Saul's army's on one side, the Philistines are on the other. Goliath, for several days, is literally walking in the no man's land between the two sides and cursing the Jews and cursing their God and challenging them to come out and fight. The Jews are like petrified. No one wants to fight this guy.
I think most people see Goliath as this big school bully that just came because he's big and he's a giant and he's going to intimidate the people of Israel. But there was a tremendous psychological game behind what he was doing. It was set up by the fact that Saul was chosen, and because the people wanted a king like all the other nations. Now, in the name of Shaul, the word Shaul is to ask. And Samuel came to the people and he said, just remember, if you choose a king the way that the nations are choosing kings, this king is going to ask everything of you. He's going to ask your sons, he's going to ask your produce. This is what a normal king will do. Keep that in mind. In comes Goliath and he calls the legions, the armies, he calls them, you are the servants of Shaul, you are the servants of Saul. He reminds them of the mistake that they made. He reminds them that they are handicapped here by preempting a king that was not supposed to be chosen. And that's when David comes to the fore. And he flips the switch.
David, at this point, his older brothers are fighting in Saul's army. But he's not fighting yet. He's too young, and he's bringing him care packages from home. Because that's always the battles of Israel. The front lines are always like in your neighborhood. We're never fighting far away. And he shows up with a care package from home, and he hears, like, Goliath cursing the Jewish God. And he says, have you no shame? You're letting this, like, uncircumcised, pagan curse the living God? And they're like, what, you're going to do something about it? And he goes, sure, no problem. So they try and put a suit of armor on him. He's so small, he can't even wear the armor.
They try to discourage him. Of course, he doesn't fit the bill. He doesn't fit the army. He doesn't fit the armor that the king tries to give him. But David has something the rest of them have lost, which is the faith that our forefathers had. And ultimately, we find that Goliath, in his spirit of intimidation, is challenging the champion, is challenging Israel, is challenging King Saul, is challenging Israel's presence in the Middle East. He's challenging God. He's challenging God's miraculous insertion of himself. He doesn't anticipate David. David is out of the blue. David is the unknown.
David may have been too small for the armor Saul offered him, but having overheard Goliath's challenge, David's passion for his people and his God more than made up for his stature. He knew God's eternal covenant with Israel that was marked by circumcision. David asked the Israelites around him, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" In his heart and mind, David knew that Goliath did not stand a chance. God was on Israel's side.
He addresses Goliath as an uncircumcised Philistine. Why is this so important? Because he brings up the covenant. He brings up the covenant also in front of his people to say, remember that you are the people of the covenant and you stand under the protection of God. David also goes and he refers to God as the Lord of hosts. He's the Lord of the armies. And that tells us when Israel came out of Egypt, they came out as an army. Even from there, he brings them back, reminding them who they are. But also, they are the legions of the living God. So he brings right back into the people their purpose. So he won the war, actually, even before he took the stones. And that was the significance of what David did that day. He restored within the people their purpose and who they are.
Armed with merely a sling and a whole lot of confidence in God's faithfulness to Israel, David descended into this very valley, the valley of Elah, to face the giant. The Bible tells us that he went to a nearby brook, a brook which still sometimes flows through this valley during Israel's rainy season, even today. And there, David selected 5 smooth stones and put them in his shepherd's bag. Then he approached Goliath, and in 1 Samuel 17, we read that, meanwhile, the Philistine with his shield bearer in front of him kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was little more than a boy. And he said to David, "Am I a dog, that you come at me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come here," he said, "and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and the whole world will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." And as the giant marched toward David, the Bible tells us that David boldly ran toward him, reaching into his bag for a stone. And with just one stone, David struck the giant on his forehead, knocking him face down onto the ground. Once the Philistines realized that their hero was dead, they fled toward Gath, Goliath's hometown, with Israel in pursuit. It was an incredible victory for Israel, one that demonstrates God's faithfulness and power to deliver them from their enemies through the most unlikely means. But how true is the story? And what do historians and archaeologists have to say about the plausibility of such incredible events? Through David's stunning triumph over Goliath, David at long last captured Israel's attention. The Bible tells us that following this victory, King Saul made David head of his army, and eventually David was crowned king. The Bible tells us that under David's leadership, the tribes of Israel were eventually united, and Israel's territory expanded to include even more of the land God had promised them. But have archaeologists uncovered anything to support this Bible story? Has archaeology even proven that David existed at all?
King David is such an amazing person and so beloved by all the readers and believers of the Bible. Interestingly enough, there was no proof that he existed up till 25 years ago when we found the Tel Dan Stele, where it was literally written the house of David. Archaeology many times proves and provides unequivocal proof of the biblical characters and also the biblical narrative.
Discovered in northern Israel, the Tel Dan Stele was inscribed by an Aramean king in the mid-8th century BCE, more than 2 centuries after the time of King David. His inscription boasts that he killed a king of the house of David. This reveals that David was, in fact, a historical king with a continued dynasty. But what evidence has been uncovered from David and Goliath's lifetime? Is there any archaeological evidence in and around this valley to suggest that a confrontation between them could very well have taken place here? Is there anything that links this location to King David at all? Archaeologist Yossi Garfinkel, who has been excavating a large tell in the area since 2008, has convincing evidence that David was here.
We are here at the site of Khirbet Kayafa. This is the Arabic name, but we think that this is biblical Sha'araim, because biblical Sha'araim is mentioned in the biblical text 3 times in association with the same location, the Valley of Elah, in association with King David, and this site is dated by radiocarbon date to King David, and the meaning of the word Sha'araim is 2 gates, and we have in this city 2 gates. When we start excavating here, we didn't know anything about the place. We didn't know that it will be from the time of David or Hezekiah or whatever. We only saw a very nice fortification and the geopolitical location in the Valley of Elah. We are here on the border between Philistia to the west and Judah to the east.
Excavations at Khirbet Kayafa, or biblical She'arim, began in 2008. After several years of excavation here, archaeologists are convinced that this is a Judean city that existed from roughly 1000 BCE until its destruction in 970 BCE, dates which also represent David's estimated lifetime. Khirbet Kayafa sits high upon the westernmost hills of Judah, where Israelite territory once met Philistine territory. If David really did become the warrior king of Israel the Bible describes, this would be the ideal location for a fortress to ensure the Philistines behaved themselves.
The way David portrayed in the biblical tradition is a warrior. The first time you hear about him is the battle of David and Goliad. He's starting as a warrior, and then all his life is described as fighting with this group or another group. And then even the tradition that when he was old, and there was a battle between the Philistines and he was almost killed, and then they told him, from now on you are not going to wars anymore. So you can see that even when he was quite older, he still joined the army of the people of Israel and Judah to be there. Because this is what is leadership. You cannot have wars, the king stay in Jerusalem and he send the army to the border. What is leadership? Leadership is that you are joining the army and you are leading the army. And I think that David certainly spent a lot of time here because this was the clash area between the Philistine and the Judean. So I'm sure that he decided to build this city because of this geopolitical situation.
According to archaeologists, this area was indeed a battle zone between the Philistines and Israel in David's lifetime. When David at last became the king of Israel, he built this fortress to serve as his headquarters during times of battle with the Philistines. But Khirbet Kayafa has offered even more exciting finds to complement the biblical narrative. Before it was excavated, there was no archaeological proof that the famous psalmist and great warrior who came to rule the vast kingdom of Israel was more than just an exaggerated Bible character. And as far as some scholars were concerned, Due to lack of archaeological evidence, David was likely just a local chieftain over a small territory, ruling over a largely illiterate culture. But discoveries at Kirbat Kaiafa have revealed otherwise. David's kingdom was much vaster than was previously understood. What is more, the psalmist's kingdom was highly literate.
In the year 2008, we found in Ostroko the first inscription. A year later, or 2 years later, a similar inscription was published from Bet Shemesh, which is only 8 kilometers away. And another year or two, another inscription of the same style was from the same time was found in Jerusalem. And a year later, we found the fourth inscription here in Kirbat Kaiafa. So in very few years, from zero, we have now 4 inscriptions from the time of David. And you see that the knowledge of writing was much widespread that anybody could imagine before.
The Ostrakon, or clay writing tablet, discovered at Kirbat Kaiafa, along with the other recent finds of its kind, reveal that David's kingdom was both literate and widespread. Consisting of early Hebrew letters, these discoveries are now presenting scholars with evidence that the Bible could have been written much earlier than was previously understood. But the Ostrakon unearthed at Kirbat Kaiafa is significant for another, more specific reason. Although its message is difficult to decipher, epigraphers are certain it contains 2 very familiar words we read in the Bible, the words judge and king.
So in one inscription we have judge and king. So it can symbolize the transition from the time of the judges to the time of the kingdom. But if it's relating to King David or King Saul or any other king, these names are not mentioned in the inscription. So if you want to relate it to a specific king, it's a matter of interpretation.
Although a king's name does not appear on the inscription, the Ostrakon itself dates somewhere between Saul's reign and David's death, making Saul or David 2 very plausible options. One thing is for sure, the Ostrakon fits into the Bible story perfectly. Written in Hebrew at the time of King David, it bears witness of the literate society around it that was familiar with both a judge and a king. But the Ostrakon is not the only outstanding find here at Kirbat Kaiafa. This time capsule from the days of King David has provided us with tangible proof of the ornate architecture described in the Bible.
One of the most amazing discoveries that we have here was a small building model, or maybe not so small. It was 35 centimeter tall and 20 centimeter wide, and it's carved like a building. And when you look at the facade of this model, you see 2 architectural features. One of them are the beam roofs. They are organized 3 together, space, 3 together, space. This is what we call triglyphs, and it's known in Greek architecture, like from the Acropolis in Athens. And the other architectural element, the doorway has recessed entrance. You have 1 frame, a 2nd frame, and a 3rd frame. This is what we call the recessed entrance. What is amazing here is that exactly the same type of architecture is described in the Bible, in the royal architecture of Solomon. When you read the description of the palace, when you read the description of the temple, you see beams organized 3 together, and you see recessed entrances. And the amazing thing that you have the biblical text that describe royal architecture in the early 10th century BC, and then you have from Kirbat Kaiafa in Judah from the early 10th century BC, exactly the same architecture. And this means that the biblical text describe houses and buildings that could be existed at the same time in the same location.
According to the Bible, King David longed to build a temple for God in Jerusalem and made preparations to do so. But the Bible tells us that this job was ultimately reserved for his son, Solomon. The shrine model at Kirbat Kaiafa reveals that the temple's design was, in fact, already in the works during David's lifetime. All of the discoveries here at Kirbat Kaiafa have truly brought to life the Bible's narrative about King David. And although evidence that David killed Goliath may be difficult to find, according to archaeologists, there is no doubt that David was once here, in this very valley, where the Bible tells us he defeated the dreaded Philistine.
Chirbe Kayafa really helped to clarify some aspect about the biblical narrative, that's for sure. Because some people were debating if there was indeed a kingdom at the time of David. And some people said, no, Judah became a kingdom only 200 years or 300 years after the time of David, because you have no archaeological evidence for fortification and writing and administration in the early 10th century in Judah. Chirbe Kayafa completely changed the picture. Now we have fortified city, we have administration, we have writing, we have the shrine model. All these things are supporting the biblical text. So I'm sure that you are standing here exactly where King David stood 3,000 years ago.
We now know that David was truly once here in the valley of Elah, right where the Bible tells us his battle with Goliath took place. But what about Goliath? How do we know that a giant from the Philistine city of Gath just might have been roaming this area as well? What can archaeologists tell us about Gath? Has evidence of giants been revealed there? Has evidence of Goliath been unearthed? And just how fierce an enemy might its inhabitants have been to Israel? Archaeologist Aaron Mayer, who has been excavating ancient Gath since 1996, can now help answer these questions and bring Goliath's hometown to life like never before.
We're now at the ancient city of Gath of the Philistines, or known as Tel Asafi Gath, which is one of the 5 large Philistine cities in the easternmost part of the region that we call in the biblical geography Philistia, which is in modern terms the southern coastal plain of Israel. This site, Tel Asafi, is a large multi-period site settled from late prehistory until modern times. And during the Iron Age, the time when the Philistines were here, this was a very large, and in fact, during part of their Iron Age, even the largest city in the entire land of Israel. And we're currently sitting in the lower city. There's a large upper city to our south, and we're sitting now in the lower city, right above one of the gates entering into the lower city from the valley below us. In the story of David and Goliath, the Philistines and the Israelites meet in the valley of Elah, and based on the geographical description, it's about 10 kilometers to our east. And we're right here in the Elah Valley to the west of that. Now, in the depiction, after the confrontation, and after David kills Goliath and the Philistines start retreating, it tells us how the Israelites chase the Philistines to Gath, this is this site, and to Ekron, which is just to the north of us. And this is the site from probably part of the Philistine forces came from.
If a confrontation between the Philistines and Israel did occur in the valley of Elah at the time the Bible records, there is no doubt that some of the army would have come from Gath, the largest Philistine city at the time. But just how powerful was this city? Would it have, in fact, been a great threat to Israel at the time the Bible describes? Was it a city fit for giants?
We found evidence of, in fact, the largest city in the land of Israel during the 11th, 10th, and 9th century. That would be, let's say, between 1100 till about 830 BCE. The city was close to 500 dunam, or that's about 125 acres. It was expanded way beyond any other period of the settlement of the city to include not only the upper tell, but also a very large lower tell. And all this area was fortified with enormous fortifications. And in fact, the fortifications were larger and more impressive, and also made of masonry that was unusually large. So there's no doubt that during the late Iron I, 11th century, and the Iron IIA, the 10th and 9th century, this was the largest, most important Philistine site, and it also was probably the most important and largest site in the entire land of Israel.
Excavations at ancient Gath have revealed that at the time of David's confrontation with Goliath, a very powerful people lived here. But are archaeologists really sure that this is a Philistine site? And has anything been unearthed that suggests that Goliath specifically could have been from this city?
This was a Philistine city. This was a culture and a people different from the people who lived to the east of God, the people who we would call Israelites. There's a clear difference in their lifestyle. There's a clear difference in their pottery. There's a clear difference in the way they build their houses, their fortifications, their temples, etc. And to add a sort of like a very nice additional point is that we even found an inscription which mentions two names, which it's not Goliath, but it's two names that are very similar to the name Goliath, which tell us that in fact the people who lived in this city during the 10th century were a people of a foreign origin, and we know that a large amount of the Philistines were of foreign origin, and in fact they had names which were quite similar to the name Goliath. So we didn't find Goliath's cereal bowl, but we did find a fragment of a bowl that had on it two names which were very, very similar to the name Goliath.
The ceramic bowl fragment discovered in Gath in 2005 represents the earliest Philistine inscription yet known. The inscribed names reveal that at the time of David's battle with Goliath, the name Goliath actually matched a foreign name that was used by the inhabitants of Gath. But the question remains, aside from the enormous size of this city, has any further evidence of giants been unearthed here?
Well, something that people ask me very often, do I have evidence of the Philistines as giants? So I always say that, first of all, I can assure you that the day that I find one large pinky bone that's oversized, it would be all over the news, but we haven't. And as of now, all excavations at Philistine sites, when we find skeletal remains, the skeletons are normal size people for that time. In fact, in antiquity, most people were much shorter than the average height today. And so there's absolutely no evidence that the Philistines were much larger than the average Israelite at the time.
Although excavations at Gath have not revealed giant skeletons, it is clear to archaeologists that Gath was in many ways a giant and powerful city, and as such, it would have presented the humble Israelites, and especially a humble shepherd boy, with an incredible military challenge. In other words, even scientists admit that Israel's victory over the Philistines of this region was quite miraculous, or at the very least, highly unexpected.
There's no question that God, during this time, more or less the time of the biblical depiction of the battle between David and Goliath, this was a large fortified site and the largest site in the region. And this probably was one of the major, if not the major, stumbling blocks or gates which made it impossible for the Judite kingdom during the time of David and even later to expand towards the west. If we conceive from what we know of what the Philistine city was and its fortifications and its technology, etc., and compare it to more or less what we have in Judah at the same time, the Philistines seems much more impressive, much more sophisticated. And usually sophisticated material culture is also an indication of a more sophisticated social organization, which probably it goes for the same thing for military organization. So it might very well be, and this seems to be also implied in the biblical text, is that the Israelites were afraid of the Philistines. The Israelites were threatened by the Philistines. The Philistines were those who were pushing eastwards. And the depiction in the biblical text of the battle of David and Goliath, up until David faces Goliath, the Philistines had their upper hand. And I think that's the sort of like the logical conclusion you would expect from such a confrontation. So I think the biblical text in which it's stressing the one-on-one fight between David and Goliath and the results that had are very much a surprise ending to the conflict, and very much puts David in a very, very special light as someone who took advantage of an unexpected situation, and because of that, the Israelites had the upper hand.
I'm walking among the archaeological remains of ancient Gath. According to the Bible, this was Goliath's hometown 3,000 years ago. And according to archaeologists, this was in fact a city that could be fit for giants at that very time. Archaeological excavations in and around the Valley of Elah are truly bringing the story of David and Goliath to life. But the question still remains, why is this such an important victory for Israel? And how does it forever change David's life and factor into God's plan of salvation for the world? The battle between David and Goliath is an inspiring Bible story with significance for every human heart. But its importance for the nation of Israel, the nation that wrote the story, is profound. Through this miraculous victory, God proved his faithfulness to his covenant with Israel by coming to her rescue through the most unlikely means, the humble shepherd boy, David. Through David's unwavering faith in God, Goliath was defeated, and Israel was vindicated before powerful enemies. But there is more. Through this miraculous victory, Israel's greatest warrior king in the making was at last fully recognized by Israel.
In one sense, David had been growing slowly in a certain level or low level of his fame. We know that the prophet Samuel had already been to David's family's house. We know that that would have made news, where Samuel goes and anoints the future king, and it wasn't the person that everybody would have expected that he would have chosen. I think that makes the news in Israel, that prophet might be doing some business with the future king. Later, King Saul knows about him because of his music background, because of his harp play, because of his ability in song. And so they have interactions on that level. And certainly by the time that he defeats Goliath the giant, the champion of the Philistines, his fame spreads even more. So what started as a small level of fame has now grown. There were songs written about David, the Bible says. Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. And so he grows into one of the greatest warriors in Israel's history. There's no doubt about that.
David's victory over Goliath was a turning point in David's life. This incredible event vaulted him to fame and closer to becoming Israel's king. And with David's victory, God's promises to Israel's forefathers were set in motion. A messianic dynasty through the tribe of Judah was about to begin.
The importance of King David is, first of all, not just as a leadership model, as a role model, but that he is, Beit David as we call it, the house of David is the official God-ordained original monarchy of human history, and his bloodline are the legitimate kings of the Jewish people all the way through to the final act of Jewish and human history, which is the Messiah. And Jewish history claims that that is the messianic bloodline will come from the family of King David. So that is an extremely important role to play in Jewish history in terms of that part of Jewish government, kingship. That is a part of government which is ordained and is genetically inherited as an official bloodline, just as the priesthood comes from the family of Aaron, Moses' brother, from the tribe of the Levites. So too kingship comes from the tribe of Judah through the family of King David all the way to the Messiah.
Not only was King David the first official king of Israel's royal and messianic bloodline, it was during his reign that Jerusalem was finally conquered and established as Israel's eternal capital city.
After Saul's death, David was already king for 7.5 years in Hebron. And that's when the tribal leaders came to him and said to him, we see that God is with you. We know that you are the anointed, but we want you to be king over all, not only over Judah. And that's when King David says, I will do so, but I will do it from Jerusalem. Jerusalem was waiting for King David. And we know that Jerusalem is the ultimate place of the kingship and the establishment of God's kingship in this world. David knew that the temple will be built on Mount Moriah. So he brought also the kingship finally to the nucleus of God's kingship, of where God's kingship will be established. And that was why King David was so important. He never drew the attention to himself. The Mashiach, the anointed king, and in Jewish thought, should be a mere man, but he has to always draw the nation and the nations around the nation of Israel, their focus only to God and God alone.
Of all the kings in Israel's long history, King David stands alone as Israel's most honored and significant king. His victory over Goliath was just the beginning of many battles that Israel would win through his leadership. His kingship marked the beginning of the royal and messianic dynasty of Israel, and its capital was established in Jerusalem. His passionate relationship with God inspired the nation of Israel to remember the covenant God had made with them, and his spirituality continues to overflow into our world even today.
King David was a tremendous warrior, but he also was the sweet singer of Zion. He wrote the Psalms that are told today, read in specifically in the Hebrew language, tremendously strong spiritual weapons of warfare when it comes to the safety and the protection of the people of Israel.
The Lord is my light and my salvation, David wrote. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? One thing I ask from the Lord, this only do I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze on the beauty of the Lord and to seek him in his temple. These are the words of King David. They reveal that his boldness overflowed from his relationship with God. And David's deepest desire was to be as close to God as possible.
Like Abram, David, in his isolation, had to find God by himself. He looked for God. He searched for God. Even in his name, we see that he is God's beloved. And he was a man after God's heart because he was a man. He made mistakes, but he walked so sincerely and so strongly with God. And his final goal every time, even through his mistakes, being set up against the odds, was always to return to bringing honor to God in everything that he did.
Through the trials David endured, he developed a deep relationship with the God of Israel, one that empowered him to knock the giant down. By example, King David reminded Israel that they were the armies of the living God and urged them closer to their unique destiny as a nation.
David had the people at heart, and the one thing that he was focusing all the time was to put the focus of the people onto God. That's also why he wrote the Psalms. He fought for it. His whole life's journey was to build God a house, to establish God's presence in the world. And for the Jewish people, that is the most important. Everything that we do revolves ultimately around establishing God's kingdom in the world.
In the distance behind me, the city of David in Jerusalem, also known as ancient Zion. The Bible tells us that after David became king in Saul's place, he captured the fortress of Zion from the Jebusites and built his palace here. God called David a man after his own heart, and he made an incredible promise to him. In Psalm 132, we read, "The Lord swore an oath to David, a sure oath he will not revoke. One of your own descendants I will place on your throne. If your sons keep my covenant and the statutes I teach them, then their sons will sit on your throne forever and ever. For the Lord has chosen Zion. He has desired it for his dwelling, saying, This is my resting place forever and ever. Here I will sit enthroned, for I have desired it. Here I will make a horn, or a strong one, or a king. I will make a horn grow up for David and set up a lamp for my anointed one. I will clothe his enemies with shame, but his head will be adorned with a radiant crown. This scripture reveals the importance of Jerusalem as God's chosen dwelling on earth. And it promises that through David's dynasty, an anointed one, or Messiah, which means Christ in the Greek, would one day inherit David's throne in Jerusalem. David was the youngest and least outstanding of 8 brothers. Standing before a nearly 10-foot tall giant warrior, David would have appeared small, ill-equipped, and weak. But David was not afraid. He knew what he was capable of with the faithful God of Israel on his side. Perhaps you are facing a giant in your life. It could be a daunting fear, a difficult task, or an impossible situation that's looming huge in your life. Perhaps you feel weak and ill-equipped to face what is confronting you. Listen to the word God spoke to the Apostle Paul when he felt exactly the same. But he said to me, My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Today, you can be confident that the very Spirit which assisted David also assists those who believe today. Though you walk through the darkest valley, you have nothing to fear. The God who has always been faithful to Israel is also faithful to you, no matter how terrifying your giants may be.